3 days before Thanksgiving, my son called and said 9 words that I have never been able to forget. Dad, Karen thinks it's better if you don't come. I was standing in my garage in Nashville, Tennessee, loading a cooler with 2 bottles of wine I had picked out specifically because my daughter-in-law once mentioned she liked them. I set the bottles down on the workbench slowly, the way you set something down when your hands have stopped working properly. I was 64 years old. I had spent the better part of 4 decades being the kind of father I wished I'd had growing up. The kind who showed up, who stayed, who never once made his son feel like a burden, and now Karen thought it was better if I didn't come. I asked my son what I had done. He said it wasn't about what I'd done. It was just the situation. I asked what situation. He said things were complicated right now, with her parents visiting from out of town, and the house being small, and the last time at Easter when I had made a comment about the way they were handling my grandson's schooling. I had made one comment, quietly, to my son alone, in the kitchen, away from everyone else. I hadn't even finished the sentence before I walked it back. Maybe Christmas, he said. We'll figure something out. I told him I understood. I hung up and stood in that garage for a long time looking at the 2 bottles of wine on the workbench. Then I put them back in the rack, went inside, and called the one restaurant in my neighborhood that I knew would be open on Thanksgiving. A diner called Blue Plate on Gallatin Avenue. I made a reservation for one. The hostess on the phone didn't say anything when I said one, but I heard the small pause before she confirmed. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up early out of habit. I had spent 30 years waking up early, 30 years as a structural engineer, showing up before everyone else, staying after everyone else left. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the framed photograph on the shelf across the room. My son at 7 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, holding up a fish we caught together at Percy Priest Lake. He looked so proud of that fish. I looked pretty proud myself. I drove to Blue Plate at noon. The diner was quieter than I expected, but not empty. A few booths were taken by people eating alone or in pairs, the kind of Thanksgiving crowd that doesn't need much from the day except a hot meal and somewhere to be. The waitress, a young woman with red hair and ink on her wrist, seated me at a booth by the window and brought coffee without me asking. I had just started on my turkey when the man in the booth across from me leaned over and said, "Excuse me, sir. My wife wants to know if you'd like to join us. We've got more food than we know what to do with, and she feels guilty about it." I looked up. The man was about my age, maybe a few years younger, with a broad face and the kind of handshake posture that meant he'd spent his life working with his hands. His wife was already sliding over to make room on her side of the booth, smiling at me like I was someone she'd been expecting. I almost said no. I had a whole speech ready. Something about not wanting to impose, something about being perfectly fine. But the woman, she had gray streaks in her dark hair and kind eyes that didn't carry an ounce of pity. Just simple, genuine warmth said, "We're Frank and Dolores Beaumont. Our kids are all out of state this year. We drove in from Clarksville just to eat at this diner because Frank refused to cook and I refused to let him." She gave her husband a sideways look. "He burns water." Frank shrugged as if this were a medical condition beyond his control. I moved to their booth. I told them my name was James. They asked if I had family nearby. I told them my son lived about 20 minutes away. There was something in the way I said it that must have told the whole story, because Dolores just nodded and didn't ask anything else. She pushed a plate of sweet potato casserole toward me and said, "Try that. I made it from scratch." We talked for 2.5 hours. Frank had been a contractor for most of his life and was now doing what he called strategic retirement, which meant he still took small jobs, but only the ones that interested him. Dolores had been a middle school art teacher for 27 years. They had 4 adult children spread across 3 states, 9 grandchildren, and what Frank described as a level of chaos at the holidays that would make a lesser man weep. I told them about my son, about Karen, about the cooler in my garage with 2 bottles of wine that were meant to be a peace offering. I hadn't planned to say any of it, but there was something about sitting in a diner booth on Thanksgiving with 2 total strangers who had no reason to care about me and had invited me to their table anyway, that made honesty feel less dangerous than usual. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That's a hard thing, James. I'm sorry." He said it the same way you'd say it to someone whose house had burned down. Not awkward, not overworked. Just plain acknowledgement that something real had happened. Dolores told me they drove back to Clarksville most Sunday afternoons after church, but they were often in Nashville during the week since their youngest son David lived here. "We're at his place most Tuesday evenings," she said. "Nothing fancy. Dinner and whatever game Frank wants to watch that neither David nor I care about." She wrote their number on a napkin from the dispenser. "You should come sometime. David's a good cook, and he always makes too much." I took the napkin. I put it in my jacket pocket. I drove home through the gray November afternoon and made a decision I didn't fully understand yet, that I was going to let that be a real invitation. Not just holiday kindness I would quietly let expire. The first Tuesday I showed up at David Beaumont's apartment on Wedgwood Avenue. I brought a 6-pack of decent beer because I didn't know what else to bring. David was 32, easy to like. The kind of person who pulled you into a conversation before you realized you'd been standing in his kitchen for 40 minutes. His girlfriend at the time, a woman named Patricia who taught nursing at Vanderbilt, took one look at me and said, "Oh good, someone who won't argue with me about the offside rule." She had apparently been fighting a losing battle on that front for months. Frank was there, pretending to help with dinner and largely getting in the way. Dolores had arranged the table with the same care you'd give a meal for 20, even though there were only 5 of us. We ate and talked and argued about things that didn't matter, and laughed more than I had laughed in longer than I wanted to calculate. When I left that night, Frank walked me to my car and said, "Same time next week?" I said yes before I had thought about it. Same time next week became the fixed point around which everything else rotated. I didn't hear from my son for the first 3 months after that Thanksgiving. I sent a text on Christmas morning. He replied 2 hours later with a photograph of my grandson opening a gift. No words. Just the photograph. I looked at it for a long time. My grandson was 4 years old. He had my son's ears. I had never met a 4-year-old with those ears. The silence hurt in the way structural damage hurts, quietly, invisibly, getting worse in places you couldn't see from the outside. But I had somewhere to be now. Tuesday evenings at David's. Occasional weekends when Frank needed an extra set of hands on a project. Sunday afternoons when Dolores decided she was making enough food for 12 and called to tell me I was expected. About 8 months after that first Thanksgiving, I arrived at David's on a Tuesday to find Dolores alone in the kitchen, standing at the stove with a stillness that wasn't her usual stillness. When she turned around, I could see she'd been crying, though she had made an effort to look like she hadn't. I asked what was wrong. She shook her head and said it was nothing. I told her it wasn't nothing if it had done that to her eyes. She set down her wooden spoon and told me about her brother. His name was Carl, and they hadn't spoken in 9 years. It had started over something to do with their father's estate, and then it had grown into everything else the way these things do. She had tried to reach out twice over the years. He hadn't responded. She had found out that morning through a cousin that Carl had been diagnosed with a serious illness. Stage 3. She didn't know how long he had. "And all I keep thinking," she said, "is that I waited. I kept waiting for him to reach out first, because I thought that was fair. I thought being right about who started it was worth waiting for, and now there might not be enough time." She looked at me steadily. "Whatever is happening between you and your son, James, don't wait for fair. Fair is something you argue about when time isn't a factor. When time is a factor, you just go." I thought about that conversation for weeks. I thought about it driving to work, driving home, lying awake at 2 a.m., with the bedroom too quiet. I thought about my grandson's ears in that photograph. I thought about picking up the phone and calling my son and saying what exactly. I wasn't sorry for the Easter comment, which I still believed was reasonable. I wasn't sorry for not being sorry enough for Karen, but I was sorry about the distance. I was sorry that a year had gone by and my grandson was now 5 years old and I was a photograph on a shelf in an apartment 20 minutes away. I called my son on a Saturday morning in October. He answered on the 3rd ring, which surprised me. I said I had been thinking about him. I said I missed him and I missed my grandson and I didn't want more time to pass. He said he had been thinking about me too. There was a warmth in his voice that made me realize how much I had been bracing for coldness. He said maybe we could get lunch sometime. Just the two of us. I said I would like that. We had lunch. It was a little careful, a little stiff, the way you are with someone you love but haven't practiced being with in a while. He talked about work. I talked about the structural engineering consulting I was doing in retirement. He mentioned my grandson was doing well, was obsessed with building things, already taking apart any toy he could get his hands on. I said that must drive Karen crazy. His face did something small when I said her name. Just a flicker. I filed it away and didn't ask. We had lunch twice more over the next 2 months. Each time a little easier. Each time I came home and thought, this is something. This is a start. I told Dolores about it one Tuesday evening while we were doing dishes. She looked at me and said, "Good. Keep going." Then, 13 months after that first Thanksgiving phone call, my son called on a Wednesday afternoon. His voice was different. Not thin the way his voice had been when he was small and something had frightened him. Controlled. The voice of a man managing something that was actively trying not to be managed. He told me he and Karen were having some financial trouble. The business she had started 2 years ago had run into problems. They had gotten behind on some accounts. There was a specific debt he mentioned, a number that needed to be cleared in the next few weeks before it became something worse. He said he had thought about whether to call me. He said he hoped I understood how hard it was to make this call. I asked how much. He said $55,000. I sat with that number for a moment. Then I asked, quietly, when we had last spoken before the lunch meetings. He said he knew it had been a long time. I said I was trying to understand something. I said that for more than a year after that Thanksgiving, I didn't hear from him. Not on my birthday. Not on Father's Day. Not on Christmas. I got one photograph by text. And then we had 3 lunches, which I was genuinely grateful for, and which had felt like the beginning of something real. And now I was getting this call. He said that wasn't fair. He said the lunches were real. He said he had genuinely wanted to reconnect. I said, I believe you. But I also need you to hear what this looks like from where I'm standing. He said what he needed was help, not a conversation about the past. And there it was. The thing Dolores had warned me about without knowing she was warning me. The moment where being needed and being valued showed you they were not the same thing. I told my son that I loved him. I told him that would never change. I told him I had been showing up for him his entire life, soccer games and science fairs and moving boxes and the long phone calls after his first real heartbreak in college. I had been there in every way I knew how to be. I said I could not give him $55,000, not because I didn't have it, but because giving him that money was not going to fix what was actually broken. I said that Karen had kept me out of his life for over a year, and I didn't think she had done it alone. And I needed him to understand that I saw that clearly, and that it had hurt me in ways I hadn't fully let myself say out loud until right now. I said I hoped he would think about all of that. I said I hoped we would find our way back to something real. But I couldn't write a check and call that love. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said I had always made everything about myself. He said Karen had told him I was the kind of person who needed to be the center of every room and couldn't stand it when someone else's life didn't revolve around my feelings. He said he was done trying to bridge the gap. He said don't call him. He said as far as he was concerned, I had made my choice years ago when I kept finding ways to make Karen feel unwelcome in his home. I didn't say anything. I let him finish. Then I said, I love you, son. That's not going to change. He hung up. I drove to the Beaumont house that evening without calling ahead. Frank opened the door, took one look at my face and said, I'll get Dolores. We sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. I told them everything. The call, the money, the things my son had said, the things I had said. They listened the way they always listened completely, without hurrying me toward the part where I felt better. When I finished, Frank put his hand on the table near mine, not touching, just present, and said, "You told him the truth. That's all any of us can ever really do." Dolores said, "Boundaries aren't walls, James. Sometimes they're the only thing that shows someone you respect both of you enough to be honest." I said it didn't feel like respect. It felt like losing my son a second time. Frank said, "You lost him the first time without saying a word. At least this time he knows exactly where you stand." That's something. I wasn't sure he was right, but I held on to it because I needed something to hold on to. 5 years passed. I am not going to pretend those 5 years were easy, because they were not. My grandson turned 6, then 7, then 8, then 9. I learned these things through the occasional update from a mutual acquaintance, through a photograph that appeared on a mutual friend's social media once, through the kind of secondhand accounting that makes a person feel like a rumor about their own life. I sent birthday cards every year. I never knew if they were opened, but my life continued. And it was genuinely good in ways I had stopped expecting it to be. I fully retired from consulting and began volunteering at a nonprofit that helped low-income homeowners with structural repairs, the kind of work that let me use everything I knew and gave it to people who needed it. Frank came with me some Saturdays. Between the two of us, we were a reasonably useful combination of skills and stubbornness. Patricia and David got married in a small ceremony at Radnor Lake. I was asked to give a toast. I worked on that toast for 2 weeks, and Frank told me it was the best thing he'd ever heard and then cried, which he will deny if asked. Dolores became a person I talked to about things I had never talked to anyone about: my own father, my divorce, the long years of trying to be a good man without a clear model for what that meant. She had a way of listening that made you feel less ashamed of the things you'd carried. I was genuinely happy. Not the scraped-together happiness of someone surviving loneliness. The settled, quiet happiness of a man who had found where he fit. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April, my son called from a number I didn't recognize. He said, "Dad." I said, "I'm here." He said Karen had left 8 months ago. He said the business had failed. He said he had been living in a smaller apartment for 6 months. He said my grandson had been asking about me. He stopped talking for a moment, and I could hear him doing the work of composing himself that men of a certain upbringing do when they need to say something they have no practice saying. "I think I've been wrong about a lot of things," he said. "For a long time. I don't know if you want to hear that from me right now. I don't know if I've earned the right to say it. But I needed you to know that I know." I asked if my grandson was all right. He said he was good. He said he was building things constantly. He said last week he had disassembled the bathroom cabinet and then put it back together with only 2 extra screws left over, which he had presented to his father as proof of success. I laughed. I couldn't help it. My son laughed too. It was the most natural thing that had passed between us in 6 years. I asked if he wanted to get dinner sometime, just the two of us. He said he would like that very much. We met at a place on Broadway, away from the tourist noise. A quiet restaurant where you could actually hear each other. He looked older. Not in a bad way. In the way that difficulty makes people look more specific. Somehow, more definitively themselves. He looked like the little boy in the photograph on my shelf had grown all the way into whoever he was always going to be. He talked for a long time. He told me about the marriage, about the years of small exclusions he had participated in, without fully seeing them for what they were. He told me about the moment, about 3 years in, when he had realized that Karen's version of events and his own memory of those events had begun to diverge in ways he couldn't explain. He told me that after she left, he had gone back over things, conversations, decisions, the Thanksgiving call, the Easter kitchen moment, and had understood for the first time that he had not been a neutral party. He had been a participant. He had chosen her comfort over his father's presence, over and over. And he had called that loyalty when it was actually something closer to avoidance. He said, "I kept telling myself, you would understand, that you were strong enough to wait it out, that you didn't need things the way other people needed things." He looked at the table. I think I knew that wasn't fair. I think I just needed it to be true. I told him I understood. I told him I had spent some years being angry, and some years being sad, and some years being genuinely fine in ways that surprised me. I told him I had people in my life who had shown me something I hadn't fully understood before, that love without obligation was real, that it existed, that strangers could become family and mean it completely. He asked about them. I told him about Frank and Dolores, about the diner on Gallatin Avenue, the Thanksgiving booth, the napkin with a phone number, about David and Patricia and Tuesday evenings, and Frank burning water. He sat quietly for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "I want to meet them." I said I thought they would like that. He said, "Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I need to know, is there a way back? Not to the way things were. I know there isn't a way back to that. But to something." I looked at my son across the table. He was 38 years old, and he had his grandfather's jaw and my father's eyes, and he looked like exactly the person. He was someone who had made real mistakes and was sitting with them without trying to make them smaller than they were. I had imagined this conversation many times over many years. In most of those imaginary versions, I had something prepared, something measured and careful that communicated both forgiveness and the weight of what had passed. What I actually said was, "You're my son. There's always a way back." He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for a long time. Maybe he had. The first time I brought him to a Tuesday dinner at David and Patricia's, they had a house now, in East Nashville, big enough to actually cook in. I was more nervous than I had been about anything in recent memory. I stood on the porch for a moment before I knocked, my son beside me, and I thought, what if this doesn't work? What if these two halves of my life don't fit together? What if the people who had become my family had no room left, or no reason, or simply too long a memory of what my son had done? Patricia opened the door and looked at my son and said, "You must be James Jr. Your dad talks about you more than he realizes." She stepped back to let us in. "Come on." David made his smoked ribs, and Frank is already trying to eat them before dinner, so we need all the interference we can get. The evening was what it was, a little careful in places, a little navigated. My son was quieter than he usually is. Dolores watched him the way she watched everyone. Patiently, without judgment, waiting for the real person underneath the nervous one to show up. Frank made a joke about the smoked ribs that was only funny in the specific context of 20 years of Frank's cooking opinions, and my son laughed in a way that meant he wasn't performing it. After dinner, while the others were doing dishes, Dolores sat down next to my son at the table. I watched them talk from across the room. I couldn't hear what they said. After a few minutes, my son nodded slowly, and Dolores put her hand briefly over his, and then she got up and went back to the kitchen as if it had been nothing. On the drive home, I asked my son what she had said to him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She said she was glad I came back, and she said that what I did to you was real, and that I should never stop knowing that. But that she had also watched your father's heart be a home for more people than it had room for, and that was, in her words, the whole point of you." He paused. I didn't totally understand what she meant, but I think I did. I didn't say anything. I just drove. That was 14 months ago. These days, Tuesday evenings have more chairs. My son comes when he can. My grandson, he's 10 now, and he has in fact designed what he calls a dual-purpose emergency vehicle, using a design pad and a level of engineering logic that I find professionally impressive, comes on the occasional weekend, and has decided that Frank is the funniest person alive, a judgment Frank accepts with complete seriousness. Karen is not a subject we discuss, though I know the divorce was hard and the custody arrangement is workable, and my son is doing the slow work of building something from what remains. Last Thanksgiving, 5 years and 1 week after that phone call in my garage, I sat at a table in David and Patricia's house with Frank and Dolores and their youngest and 2 grandchildren who had driven in, and my son and my grandson, and Patricia's mother who was visiting from New Orleans and needed no excuse to tell stories. My grandson sat next to me because he had decided that was his assigned seat, and he enforced the assignment with the kind of serene authority that skips generations. At some point during dinner, Frank made a toast. Frank's toasts are famous in this group for being long, technically a digression, and somehow still landing exactly right. He talked about the Thanksgiving 5 years ago in the diner. He talked about a man eating alone at a window booth with a look on his face like he was reading a letter and finding out something he hadn't expected. He said Dolores had nudged him 3 times before he finally got up and said something. He said he almost didn't. He said he thanked God he had a wife who nudged. My son, sitting across the table, raised his glass to me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Later, after most of the dishes were done and my grandson had fallen asleep on the couch under Frank's coat, I found myself in the kitchen doorway watching the room. Dolores laughing at something David said, Frank pretending to disagree with Patricia's mother about something they actually agreed on, my son scrolling through his phone with the particular calm of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Dolores appeared beside me with a dish towel over her shoulder and a cup of coffee. She handed me the coffee. "How are you doing?" she asked. I told her I was fine. I meant it in the way I had not meant it for many years, not as a deflection, not as a performance of okayness, but as a plain description of a true thing. She nodded. "Good," she said, and then she went back to the dishes. If you're watching this, and you're somewhere that feels too quiet right now, maybe you've been told you're too complicated, too much, something I want you to know that the distance between where you are and where you want to be can close. Not all at once. Not painlessly. Not on anyone's schedule except the real one, which nobody shows you in advance. But it closes. And sometimes it starts with a stranger in a diner booth who makes room for you at their table. And sometimes that stranger becomes the realest family you've ever had. And sometimes, years later, the son who broke your heart without meaning to sits across from you and looks at you like he finally sees what he almost threw away. The best response to rejection is not anger. It's not revenge. It's building a life so full of genuine love that when the people who pushed you away finally look up, they see something they recognize as exactly what they lost. That's all. That's everything. If this meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every one. I'll see you next time.